So let's go back into our last image. This image was taken at dawn, just as the sun came up over the horizon. So it was just at the point where the sun was starting to illuminate this side of the house here. And we can see that because this part of the lighthouse is illuminated, the foreground goes very, very dark. So the first thing I'll do is I'll open up the shadow area to reveal a lot of the detail in that foreground area. So that works pretty good for me right now. If I wanted to increase sort of the warmth of this part of the photograph and this part of the lighthouse, I could use my vibrance slider. And what it does is it just takes areas of the image that are less saturated and adds some saturation to them. I'm going to see if I can use the graduated filter on the bottom of the image instead and apply this graduation right about there on the image. And let's see if we can just boost the exposure on that part of the photograph alone. And just to find some balance. And I like what's going on there. Okay, so I'm going to come back and click my hand tool, and that applies that function. I'm going to go up into my lens correction tool, and I just want to correct some of the distortion that is happening with this image. And there's a fair bit of distortion because it's photographed with a 21mm lens, which creates a lot of distortion in the photograph. So I'll just add some of this distortion reduction, and that looks pretty good. So I'll leave it there. I'm going to come up to this tool, which is called my transform tool, and select that tool. And right now I want to level this image. So it was dark out and I couldn't quite get my camera level. And I just want to correct for that slight tilt to the camera. And this will basically level the position of the camera. And I want to take this slider and see what effect it has to the image. So this will help correct some of the vertical distortion. And then the aspect ratio, as you can see, can make my image look taller or quite short and squat. So I want to just add some stretching to this image so it looks a little bit taller. And that looks pretty good for me right now. Now you can see that whenever we transform an image, we see this part in the photograph, and that means as we transform the image, it's moving parts of that photograph around. And as we move it, parts of the image start to get cropped. So I'm going to come up to my crop tool. Once again, draw a line out and bring that crop to right there, and then hit the hand key, and that has corrected my image. Now if I wanted to, let's just go back into hue and saturation, and let's look at our yellows. And let's just saturate those just a little bit to get a slightly warmer glow on the front of the lighthouse. And what that does is it creates a nice contrast of color on the front lit side of the lighthouse and with respect to the shadow side of the lighthouse. And I like that. So I'm happy with that. And just so you know, this exposure was just under a minute at f16 at ISO 80 with a 21mm lens. Now I'm going to make one more adjustment coming up to my color sampler tool. I want to see how bright that is. So that's only a value of 188, which is fairly dark. I'm going to come back into here and just make an adjustment to those highlight areas and just brighten that up so it doesn't look as flat and muddy. And I think that is a good final adjustment for tone. And come into my clarity slider, which once again increases the amount of contrast between sort of the mid-tones. And let's apply this dehaze filter like that. So that's a good adjustment. And our sharpening. So I know for my camera, a sharpening factor of about 110 and a radius of about 1.5 will add a lot of sharpness to my photograph. So now I think that image really pops. There's some really nice contrast to it. Really nice sense of the foreground and the background. So I'm happy with all of these images, and we could actually just print these images straight from our Adobe Camera Raw, but I like to use Photoshop to resize the image and prep them for printing. Now, all of these images are different, so I will not go into my sync settings here because it doesn't make sense that I apply the same color correction of this image to that image. So I've corrected each of these images individually. And I'm going to go Save Images. And we'll see that I'm going to keep the name of the images as they are. Save in new locations. So let's select Folder. And I will select Desktop and New Folder. And I will call them PEI Finals. And I will create that folder, select, and once again, before I process any of my images, I always want to check to make sure that my settings are correct. So my file naming and my file extension, I will be outputting these files as Photoshop files. I want to include all the metadata in them, which is basically the data that gets embedded in a file that tells us how the photograph was taken, the type of camera, where it was taken, all of these types of settings. And the color space, Adobe RGB, 8 bits per channel, and my resolution of 300 dpi. So then I would hit the Save button, and it's going to save all of those photographs in that folder. And then I could reopen these photographs in Photoshop and resize them for final printing, or set them up to be processed as JPEGs. So we'll just leave it at that.